Hello friends, it's good to have you here with me tonight. Wherever you are, tucked into bed, settled on the couch, the lights already dim around you. Welcome back. I'm very glad you came. Picture this. You are sitting at a small wooden table in a room lit by a single flame. In front of you is a mirror, not glass, not the kind you know, but polished metal, so it gives back your face a little softly, a little dimly, like a reflection seen through still water. And on the table before you, tucked between a small cloth and a bottle of rosewater, is a pot. It's plain, unremarkable, but what's inside it is smooth and white and cold to the touch, like paste, like something chalky and fine. You pick it up and you begin. Tonight, we're going to talk about beauty, but not quite the kind you might be expecting. Because the most surprising thing about Tudor beauty, about the things women rubbed on their faces in 16th century England, isn't that some of them were poisonous. That part you may have heard. The part that most people don't know is something else entirely. It's that these women often knew, they knew, or at least strongly suspected, that what they were putting on their faces was slowly damaging them, and many of them continued anyway. Not because they were foolish, not because they were vain in the way we use the word now as a light insult, but because in Tudor England how you looked was not a personal choice. It was a social contract. It was a declaration of rank. It was in some cases a quiet matter of survival. And the story of why, of what drove women to the dressing table morning after morning reaching for something dangerous, is a story about beauty as a trap. And tonight, carefully and slowly, that's exactly what we're going to explore together. If this kind of quiet, careful history is the thing that helps you slow down at the end of the day, I'd love it if you subscribed and left a like. It truly does mean a great deal, and if you feel like it, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I always like to know. Now, let the lights go as soft as they can. Let whatever's still going on in the world outside fall away for a little while. There's nothing you need to do tonight except listen. We're going a long way back, to a world of candlelit chambers and silver mirrors and small dangerous pots of white. And all you have to do is come along. The candle is burning. Let's begin. The world that produced Tudor beauty was not, at its heart, a world preoccupied with beauty. It was a world preoccupied with survival. And in that world, how you looked was not a private matter. It was a public one, read, judged and acted upon by everyone around you from the moment you stepped into a room. Let me place you there. It is a morning in Elizabethan England. You're a gentlewoman, not a queen, not a servant, but somewhere in the status-conscious middle world of court life and respectable households. Your husband has a modest position. You have obligations. You will be seen today. And so you are already at your dressing table, even though the fire has barely warmed the room, even though the light outside is still the grey of early morning. The work of appearing in Tudor England is not something you squeeze into 10 minutes. It is, in a very real sense, your work. It is the daily labour that your world expects of you, quietly and completely, without ever quite putting it into words. What you're trying to achieve this morning, what every woman of your station is trying to achieve, is a specific thing. Not just cleanliness, not just neatness. The ideal in Elizabethan England is white. Not fair, not light. White, the colour of fresh snow, of bleached linen, of a face that has never once been touched by the open sun. And you understand why, even if nobody has ever said it to you plainly. Because the sun in this world is not a luxury. The sun is a consequence of labour. A tanned complexion means you work outside, in the fields, in a market, at a wash line. It means your body has been given over to function rather than to something more elevated. A weathered face is not a mark of health here. It is a mark of a social position that you cannot afford, one you are working every morning to distance yourself from. Pale skin says something entirely different. Pale skin says you have never bent over a field in your life. It says your husband can afford to keep you indoors. It says your family has never needed you to labour under the sky. The aristocracy of Tudor England wore their pallor the way they wore their titles, not as an accident, but as a statement, a declaration, something that needed to be maintained and renewed every single day. The poets knew this. They wrote about it endlessly. The ideal English beauty of the Tudor period appears in poem after poem. White as snow, white as alabaster, white as the moon. Red lips, white skin, gold hair. These weren't simply preferences in the way we might prefer one thing to another. They were a code, and every woman who moved through the social world of Tudor England knew exactly how to read it. Think about what that means for a moment. The pressure to meet a beauty standard is nothing new. That much is obvious. But the standard itself in Tudor England had an unusual quality. It wasn't about attractiveness in a personal or individual sense. It was about legibility, about being read correctly by the people around you. And being read correctly had direct, practical consequences for your life. Your marriage prospects depended on it. Your standing at court depended on it. The respect you were shown by tradespeople, by neighbours, by the people whose good opinion you needed. All of it was filtered through the way your face looked when you walked into a room. In this world, appearance was not a supplement to your social identity. It was, in significant part, your social identity. And here is the thing that most people miss when they think about Tudor beauty. Here is the detail that changes the story entirely. The women sitting at those dressing tables, reaching for their powders and their pastes and their bottles of rose water. They were not making free choices from a range of harmless options. They were responding to a system that left them very little room to do otherwise. The standard was set. The code was established. The expectations were enforced, not by law, not by explicit rule, but by the subtle and relentless machinery of social judgment. To fall short of the standard was to risk being read as common, or old, or unwell, or insufficiently careful about your station. None of those readings were minor inconveniences. In the marriage market of Tudor England, they could be life-altering. And there was one more thing pressing down on all of this. One more reason why the ideal of white, unmarked, perfect skin was not just desirable, but urgent. Something that was far less controllable than social pressure and far more frightening. Smallpox. Smallpox was present throughout the Tudor period, a familiar, feared visitor that moved through populations without much discrimination, and left its mark plainly on the faces of those it touched. Not everyone who contracted it died, but many who survived were scarred. Pockmarks, deep pits in the skin of the cheeks, the forehead, the chin. Permanent, visible, impossible to explain away. And in a world where the beauty standard demanded unbroken, unmarked, porcelain white, where a single scar could signal illness, could signal something wrong, could undermine the carefully maintained image of health and prosperity and gentle-born perfection, a face marked by smallpox was not merely an aesthetic problem. It was a social one. It was a problem that needed solving, every morning at the dressing table before the day could begin, which is how we arrive at the pot. That small, plain pot, sitting there on the table, the one that is cool and smooth when you open it, and smells faintly of something sharp beneath the rosewater, the one that has been sitting in households across England, in great houses and modest ones, at court and far from it, for well over a century by the time our story takes place. It is not medicine. It is not quite ordinary either. It is something in between, something that every woman at certain level of English society knows about, has used, has perhaps been using since she was old enough to sit at her own dressing table, and tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, she will reach for it again. The candle flickers once very gently, the mirror waits, and the question, the real question, the one this whole story turns on, is not what is in the pot. You'll find that out very shortly. The question is, what did it cost to reach for it? But first, let's stay here a little longer, in this room, in this light, in this moment just before the day begins. Because the thing about Tudor beauty, the thing that gets lost when people talk about lead paint and poison, is that it happened here, in quiet rooms before anyone else was awake, in the small, private, daily act of getting ready to face the world. You look into the metal mirror. It doesn't flatter you in the way a modern mirror might. The reflection it gives back is slightly hazy, slightly imprecise. But you know your own face. You know where the light catches it. You know which angle is most forgiving. You've been doing this long enough to know. The standard you are working toward is not yours. It never was. It was handed to you by the court, by poetry, by the women around you who set the example, by a queen whose own face had become something more than a face. It was handed to you so completely, so early, that it probably doesn't feel like a standard at all. It just feels like what a face is supposed to look like, what your face is supposed to look like on days when you're presentable. The pressure of that, the quiet, relentless, invisible weight of it, is the real beginning of this story. Not the chemistry, not the recipes, not the lead. This. Because every dangerous thing that ends up on a Tudor dressing table starts here, in this feeling, in the gap between the face in the mirror and the face the world expects to see, in the decision made again and again every single morning, to close that gap by whatever means are available. And in Tudor England, the means were varied, and many, and some of them were extraordinary. Some were gentle and botanical, rosewater and egg whites and crushed almonds, things your grandmother might have used. And some of them were something else entirely, something that a woman today, reading the ingredient list, would set down immediately and back away from. We'll get to those shortly. We are, in fact, headed directly toward them. But I want to make sure, before we do, that you understand the world that made them necessary. Because without that understanding, the women who used these products look careless, they look reckless, or naive, or simply vain in the most reductive sense. They were none of those things. They were women doing what their world required of them, using the tools their world provided, navigating a set of expectations they had not designed and could not, individually, dismantle. And the daily act of sitting at that dressing table, of opening that small plain pot, was not a failure of intelligence. It was a response to a system that was very good at making its demands feel like personal choices. The fire in the grate is settled now. The light is a little warmer. Outside, very faintly, the day is beginning to arrive, and on that dressing table the candle still burns small and steady, throwing a circle of gold across the wood. The pot is still open, and what's inside it, what it is, where it came from, what it did to the women who used it, that is exactly where we're going next. You felt some version of this, I suspect. Not the same stakes, not the same century, not the same social machinery pressing down on you in quite the same way. But that feeling of sitting in front of some kind of mirror, looking at your own face and measuring it against something you didn't choose, that feeling is not confined to Tudor England. These women were not strangers. They were not creatures from a world so distant that their choices are beyond understanding. They were people who knew in their bones the experience of trying to look like the thing the room needed them to be. The pressure didn't disappear when they stepped away from the dressing table. It came with them. It was always there, underneath everything. But knowing you need to look a certain way, and knowing how to achieve it, those are two very different problems. And the solution Tudor England had arrived at was already waiting. On that table, in that pot, in that white, smooth, cold substance that sat there every morning, as familiar as the candle. Let's open it. Let's find out what it was. Its name, if you were a Tudor woman who knew what she was buying, was Ceruse. More specifically, Venetian Ceruse. Venice was where the finest version came from, or was said to come from, and in the cosmetic world of Tudor England, the word Venetian, attached to any product, was a mark of quality. The Venetians, it was understood, knew how to make things well. What Ceruse actually was, stripped of its Italian name and its luxury reputation, was this: white lead. Lead carbonate. The compound formed when metallic lead is exposed to acetic acid, which is the acid found in vinegar, over a sustained period. The result is a fine white powder, smooth and dense, which when mixed with water, or rose water, or a small amount of egg white, becomes a paste. Opaque, even, the colour of fresh snow. In the language of alchemy, and Tudor England was very much a world in which alchemy and what we'd now call chemistry occupied the same intellectual space. Lead was known as Saturn. The planet, the metal, and the ancient melancholy god all collapsed into one name. Ceruse was sometimes called spirits of Saturn, which is either a beautiful name for a cosmetic or an ominous one, depending on what you know about what Saturn does to the human body. Venetian Ceruse was the premium version, genuine, pure, made by craftsmen who understood the preparation process. It came in small pale cakes or blocks, white as chalk, and it was expensive. Not extravagantly so, but expensive enough to mark it as a product of the upper social orders. Cheaper imitations existed, of course, made with less care and less precision, with results that the practiced eye could distinguish. Women who used this product daily developed a fine sense for the difference between real Venetian Ceruse and its substitutes. You develop a feel for something when you use it every single morning of your adult life. There were, in fact, different grades available, different levels of refinement, different qualities of the base material, different prices to match. The finest Ceruse left the skin looking perfectly smooth. The cheaper kinds could leave a patchy, uneven finish, or a faint greyish undertone even on application, and it is worth pausing on that detail for just a moment. Because in a world where women were choosing between different grades of a lead-based cosmetic, weighing the quality of different kinds of poison against each other, paying more for the better one, what that tells you is not that they were reckless. It tells you that they were consumers, making careful purchasing decisions within the options their world provided, which is, in its way, a deeply human thing. The application itself had a ritual to it. The Ceruse block was mixed, with rose water, usually for the scent of it, and to give the paste a workable texture. Not too thick, or it would crack when the face moved. Not too thin, or it wouldn't provide the coverage it was meant to. The consistency mattered. You know this. You've come to know it. The way a baker knows dough. Then came the application. With a cloth or a soft brush, or the careful tips of the fingers, strokes across the forehead, the cheeks, the chin, the throat, the neck too, and the backs of the hands, anywhere that skin might be visible against the dark cloth of a formal gown. The ceruse was worked into every surface evenly, filling in every pore, smoothing every uneven patch of colour, obscuring every mark that the real face had accumulated over the years. Over the ceruse, once it had set slightly, came powder. A fine dusting of white powder, sometimes the same material in a drier form, to mattify the surface, to take away any shine, to fix the paste in place through the hours of the day ahead. The final effect was a face that was smooth and white and uniform in a way that real skin, even very fair skin, cannot quite achieve on its own. It was not subtle, it was not attempting to look natural. It was, quite deliberately, a mask, an announcement, a surface so perfectly white that it declared itself immediately to anyone in the room. You can almost catch the smell of it if you try. There was the rose water, sweet and floral, the respectable scent that covered everything, and beneath it, if you knew to look for it, something else, something metallic, faint, the way an old coin smells after it's been held in a warm hand for a while. That was the lead. It was always there, underneath the sweetness, if you paid attention. And now we come to the part that is genuinely strange, the part that is harder to explain and harder to dismiss. The ceruse worked, in the short term, on the day of application, in the morning light of the dressing table. It did exactly what it promised. It gave a woman the face the world told her she needed. Smooth, white, unmarked, composed. The ideal, realized in paste and powder. But lead is patient. It doesn't announce its damage immediately. It doesn't hurt on the first morning or the first month. It works slowly, accumulating, finding its way through the skin and into the blood, into the deeper structures beneath the surface. And what it does there, over weeks and months of daily use, is quietly devastating. Lead interferes with the skin's ability to renew itself. It damages the fine underlying structures that keep skin elastic, supple, capable of holding its shape. After sustained exposure, the skin begins to change in ways that are, unfortunately, quite visible. It takes on a grey undertone, it dries, it loses its elasticity. Fine lines appear earlier than they should. The texture coarsens and roughens. Patches form. The very things the ceruse was applied to conceal, the marks of age, the evidence of a life lived, are brought forward faster and made worse by the ceruse itself. And so the woman at the dressing table the following morning applies a little more ceruse to cover the new patches, the new dryness, the slight greyness that wasn't there 6 months ago. And the new layer causes more damage, and the layer after that has to be thicker still. Historians call this the vicious cycle of ceruse use. It is not a dramatic phrase being applied loosely to history. It is a precise description of a biological trap that closed, quietly, around women who had no way of seeing it clearly, because by the time the skin damage was obvious, the habit was already deeply established, and the social need that had driven them to the product in the first place had not diminished at all. The makeup created its own demand. The more you used it, the more you needed it. The less you could stop, because stopping meant revealing the very evidence you had been working to conceal. A man named Sir Hugh Platt published a book in 1602 called Delights for Ladies, a title that belonged to its intended readers, if not to its author. It was a household guide, a practical manual for the well-run gentlewoman's world, and it contained beauty recipes. Some were gentle, rosewater and almond oil, herbs infused in vinegar, simple and botanical and reasonably harmless. Others sat on the same page in the same ink and recommended things considerably less benign. The book did not always tell you which was which. It assumed a reader who already knew the landscape, who understood that the dressing table was not a simple place. It is genuinely difficult to sit with this detail, that a guide to ladies' delights, a practical household book, could contain both a recipe for a soothing face wash and a recipe for a compound that would, with sustained use, damage the very skin it was meant to care for. Side by side, without apology, without warning, simply information offered to a reader who would decide for herself what to do with it. And the ceruse, we should remember, was only the foundation. It was the first layer, the necessary base. But the face, once it had been made white, still needed more. Colour, definition. The particular brightness that ceruse alone, for all its smoothing power, could not provide. For that there were other things on the dressing table, other pots, other powders, other preparations, and some of them were, if anything, more immediately troubling than the ceruse itself. But before we move to those, let's stay just another moment with what we've just described, because there is something in the vicious cycle that is worth sitting with. Not because it's shocking, it isn't really, once you understand it, but because of what it reveals about the shape of the trap. Here is a woman who is using a product every morning that is slowly and invisibly destroying the very thing she is using it to protect. She cannot see the damage happening in real time. She can only see that her skin, month by month, is worsening, and her only available solution within the world she inhabits is more of the product that is causing the problem. The cure and the cause are the same thing. The remedy and the damage are the same hand. It is genuinely strange, if you sit with it. Not disturbing in a dramatic way, but quietly strange. That this situation persisted for well over 100 years in England. Not because people were oblivious, not because no one raised a voice. The situation persisted because the product delivered. Because the morning after you applied it, the face in the mirror looked the way the world required it to look, and that in Tudor England was not a small thing. It was in many ways everything. The candle on the dressing table is burning lower now. The morning is properly here, pale winter light pressing at the shuttered windows, the household beginning to stir in the rooms below. You can hear it, very faintly, the sounds of the day assembling itself, and on the table in front of you, the white pot, the rose water, the fine dusting brush. There are other things as well, other small containers, other preparations, one in particular a reddish colour, warm like dried berries, sitting in its own small ceramic pot with a cloth stopper pressed in the top. And it is that pot, the red one, that we need to talk about next. Here is something that most people don't immediately think about when they think about the poisonous beauty of Tudor England. They think about the white, the ceruse, the foundation. But the full routine, the complete daily ritual of a court-conscious woman, didn't stop there. Once the white mask was in place, the face needed what white alone cannot provide. It needed warmth, it needed the appearance of life, it needed colour. Rouge, in Tudor England, went by another name. It was called fucus. That word, borrowed from an older tradition, simply meant a dye or colouring used on the face, and fucus was applied to the lips, the cheeks, sometimes a faint wash at the inner corners of the eyes, all the places where blood shows through living skin, where the face communicates warmth and health and youth. The problem, of course, is what fucus was made from. The most common pigment for a deep, stable, convincing red in Tudor and Elizabethan England was cinnabar. And cinnabar is mercuric sulfide, red mercury, a compound of one of the most toxic elements on Earth, combined with sulfur, producing a pigment so brilliantly, reliably red that it had been used in art and cosmetics for thousands of years before anyone quite understood what it was doing to the people who handled it every day. Applied to the lips, pressed onto the mouth with a small cloth or a brush, this rouge created the desired effect. Warm colour, definition. The appearance of vitality against the white mask of the ceruse. And every time the lips were moistened, every time the tongue touched the corner of the mouth in the unthinking way that tongues do throughout a long social afternoon, a small amount of mercury passed from the surface into the body. This was not acute poisoning. Not the kind that announces itself immediately and dramatically. It was, like the ceruse, the slow accumulation kind. The kind that builds over months and years, finding its way into the nervous system, into the organs, into the spaces between the things that keep a body functioning. Mercury poisoning is patient, in the way that lead poisoning is patient, and it announces itself when it does, in ways that could easily be explained by other causes. Tremors that might be age, a fogging of memory that might be exhaustion, a weakness in the limbs that might be any number of ordinary things. And still, every morning, the rouge was applied, because a white face without any warmth in it looked ill, not aristocratic. The balance was everything. Too much colour and you looked common or theatrical. Too little and you looked unwell. The exact right amount of mercury red on the exact right amount of lead white. That was the standard. That was what was required. The dressing table holds all of this quietly, the white pot and the red one side by side, and then there was the cleanser. This is the detail that surprises people most when they hear it. Because even if you accept that the foundation was lead and the rouge was mercury, you might assume that at least the end of the day, the washing off of all of it, the return to the bare face, was safe, neutral. The one moment in the routine that caused no damage, you would be wrong. Mercury sublimate, a different compound of mercury, more caustic than cinnabar, was commonly used in face washes during the Tudor and Elizabethan period. Mixed with rosewater or honey or other softening agents, it was applied to cleanse, to brighten, to prepare the complexion for the next morning's application. In small amounts, it acted as a kind of chemical peel, stripping away the top layer of skin, temporarily making the surface appear smoother and more even, which is, if you think about it, exactly the trap. A short-term result that makes a long-term poison very difficult to stop using. So consider what a full day looked like for a woman serious about her appearance at the Tudor court. In the morning she applies ceruse, lead, to her face, her throat, her hands. Over that cinnabar rouge, mercury, to her lips and cheeks. She wears this throughout the day, in warm rooms, in candlelight, in close proximity to other people. And in the evening she removes it with a mercury wash. Then she applies a resting preparation to the skin, often something containing further botanical or mineral compounds, and she sleeps. And in the morning she begins again. The product meant to undo the poison was in some preparations another poison. The start of the day and the end of it were bookended by the same slow accumulation, just arriving from different angles. Now, here is the part of this story that changes everything. Here is the detail that I want you to hold on to because it reframes every single thing we've discussed so far. Most people, when they hear about these beauty practices, assume that Tudor women simply didn't know, that they were unaware of the dangers, that medicine hadn't yet discovered what lead and mercury did to the human body, and so they used these products in good faith, with no reason to suspect the harm they were causing. That assumption is wrong. The danger was known. Not with the precision we have now, not in the language of lead carbonate concentrations and blood toxicity thresholds, but the general association between these materials and illness was present in the medical writing of the period. Physicians in Tudor and Elizabethan England published pamphlets and treatises warning against ceruse and mercury in cosmetics. They described the skin damage. They noted the connection between heavy cosmetic use and declining health in women who use these products. They put it in writing, and they made that writing available. The medical establishment of Tudor England had concerns. They expressed those concerns in print. They were, as a general rule, completely ignored, which, to be fair, is not entirely different from the relationship between public health advice and public behaviour in any era you care to name. The mechanism is remarkably consistent across centuries. But here is what makes the Tudor situation distinct. The physicians were ignored because the women who heard those warnings understood something the physicians did not fully account for, something their clinical remove had left out. The cost of looking wrong in Tudor England was not merely aesthetic, it was practical, it was material, it had real consequences for a real life. A woman at court who stopped using ceruse, who let her natural complexion, whatever it was, be seen without the white mask, was not making a private health decision. She was making a public social statement, signalling, whether she intended to or not, that she was no longer maintaining her appearance to the required standard. And in a world where appearance was bound up with rank, with marriage, with the good opinion of the people whose goodwill you needed to navigate daily life, that signal had consequences. So the women chose the ceruse, knowing or half knowing or suspecting. They reached for it anyway, not because they valued their appearance more than their health in some simple, shallow way, but because within the world they inhabited, the dressing table was not a luxury, it was a necessity, and the pot of poison on that table was the price of admission to the life they needed to live. There is something in that I find genuinely difficult to dismiss, and I suspect you may too, that the knowledge existed, that the warnings were written and circulated, and that the choice to continue was made anyway, morning after morning, by women who were navigating a system that gave them no good options. There was no safe version of the dressing table that also met the requirements of their world, not one that was available to them, and the ceruse and the rouge were not the only things. There was one more preparation, sitting not on the dressing table exactly but on the shelf nearby, in a small dark bottle with a glass stopper. Belladonna, deadly nightshade, a plant whose name means beautiful woman, Belladonna, and whose properties have been known since antiquity. A drop or two of its extract placed into the eye directly dilates the pupil, makes the eye appear larger, darker, more luminous, more alive. You can picture the effect and the appeal. The wide, soft gaze that artists painted into their ideal faces was not always natural. Belladonna had been used this way since at least the Renaissance in Italy, and the practice was known in Tudor England too, among women who knew what to ask for and where to find it. The result, on the day of application, was exactly as intended. Eyes that seemed to glow with an inner warmth, pupils wide and dark against the iris. The cost was slower in arriving, but real. Regular use of belladonna as an eye treatment caused blurred vision. The pupil held unnaturally wide cannot focus correctly, and the world goes soft and imprecise. Light became painful, and in cases of sustained, frequent use, the damage to the eye's ability to regulate itself could become permanent. There are accounts of women in the Renaissance period who were effectively blind in bright light after years of Belladonna use, able to see in dim indoor spaces in candlelit rooms, but helpless in the full light of day. Which means that the ideal beauty, the ceruse white face, the cinnabar red lips, the wide dark eyes of the Belladonna, was a beauty specifically designed for interior spaces, for candlelight, for the kinds of rooms in which Tudor court life took place. Step outside into full daylight, as you might, leaving the court for a moment in your mind, and the picture changed considerably. There is something quietly ironic about that. The perfect Tudor face was a face built for darkness, and it is in that detail, the image of a woman at a candlelit dressing table, applying a face designed for candlelit rooms to move through a life conducted largely by candlelight, that we find the figure who came to define this entire aesthetic, whose face became the standard that everyone else was trying to meet. Her name you already know, but the story is more complicated than you might expect. There is a painting you may have seen without quite registering it. A portrait of a woman, late middle age perhaps, though it's difficult to tell because the face is so entirely covered with white that age has been effectively erased from it. The skin is the colour of paper. The hair above the white forehead is a rich reddish gold, still vivid, and the eyes, dark, steady, looking directly outward from the canvas, suggest a person of considerable intelligence and considerable will. That is Queen Elizabeth I, or rather, that is the face Queen Elizabeth I chose to show the world in the final decades of her reign. The image she constructed, maintained, and controlled with the same deliberateness with which she managed every other aspect of her political existence. Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558. She was 25 years old. She was, by the accounts of those who saw her in those early years, a striking woman. Red hair, pale skin, dark eyes, a posture and presence that commanded rooms. She did not, in the first years of her reign, require the extreme white mask of Ceruse to present an impressive face to the world. She was already impressive. Then, in 1562, she contracted smallpox. The illness nearly killed her. She survived it, a survival that her court treated as something close to miraculous, one that shaped the political narrative of her reign in ways that are still discussed by historians. But the smallpox left marks, pockmarks on the face that had been, before the illness, unmarked. The records of the period are careful and somewhat elliptical on this subject. How much visible scarring exactly the Queen sustained is not entirely clear, but the broad outline is not seriously in doubt. The illness changed her face, and the face that followed was managed differently than the face that came before. It is at this point that the Ceruse enters the story of Elizabeth I, or rather, it is at this point that most accounts of Elizabeth I introduce the Ceruse. Heavy lead-based foundation, applied increasingly thickly as the decades passed, building up layer by layer toward the theatrical white mask of the final portraits. The Virgin Queen behind a wall of lead paint. Here the story requires some honesty. Modern historians have noted that the evidence for Elizabeth's personal Ceruse use, the specific documented evidence, is less definitive than the popular account suggests. The royal account books do not contain clear, unambiguous entries about Ceruse procurement, not in the quantities the portrait tradition implies. The image of Elizabeth as the lead-painted queen was significantly amplified by Victorian-era writers, who found the image both dramatic and morally legible. Vanity, they thought, its own punishment. The Victorians were fond of that kind of story. What is not in doubt, what the historical record does support clearly, is this. Elizabeth's appearance was a matter of state. Her face was not simply her face. It was a political instrument, a symbol of the monarchy's health and continuity and power, managed with extraordinary care by the Queen herself and by the apparatus of the court around her. The portraits were controlled images. The access to the Queen's actual person was strictly managed. What the public saw of Elizabeth I was what Elizabeth I chose to show them, and what she chose to show them, increasingly as the decades passed and the face behind the image aged, was a face of composed, formidable, ageless authority. White, still, commanding. Whether through Ceruse or through the artistry of her court painters, or some combination of both, the image itself was real, and the image set a standard. Because women at court looked at Elizabeth and took their cue from her, the Queen's aesthetic became the aspiration. The extreme pallor, the thin arched brows, the particular architecture of the ideal Elizabethan face, these were not trends that arose independently and happened to match the Queen's look. They radiated outward from her. She was, in the most literal sense, the standard, and in trying to meet that standard, in reaching for the white pot on their own dressing tables, in applying their own ceruse and their own fucus in the guttering candlelight of their own chambers, the women of Elizabeth's court were doing something that felt to them like loyalty as much as vanity, like participation, like belonging to something larger than themselves. Think about what that means for a moment. Elizabeth herself had very little that was entirely hers. Her body was discussed in Parliament. Her marriage was debated by foreign ambassadors. Her health was a matter of national anxiety. Her face was propaganda. Even the act of standing at a mirror in the early morning, something so private, so personal, so small, was never only hers. It was always also political, always also the nation's. And the women around her who applied their own white masks each day, they were participating, whether they knew it or not, in something that extended far beyond their own dressing tables. They were maintaining a visual language. They were speaking a dialect that the whole world of the court understood. They were, in their way, doing their part. There is something worth holding gently in that image. All those women, at all those dressing tables, in the cold mornings before the court day began, applying their ceruse, mixing their fucus, reaching for the small dark bottle, performing the daily ritual that their world required. Not because they were vain in the dismissive sense we sometimes mean, but because they were present, in the fullest way they knew how, in the world they inhabited, and the Queen herself, the woman whose face set all of this in motion, was engaged in something considerably more deliberate than any of them, because Elizabeth understood with extraordinary clarity that her face was not merely her face, it was a political object, and she managed it accordingly. There is a document from 1563, early in Elizabeth's reign, in which the Privy Council issued a draft proclamation about portraits of the Queen. The concern was that unflattering or inaccurate portraits were circulating, giving the public an image of Elizabeth that did not serve the monarchy's interests. The proclamation proposed that a single approved likeness be created by a skilled painter, from which all other portraits would be made, ensuring that the image of the Queen in circulation was controlled and consistent. This proclamation was not, in the end, formally issued in the form drafted, but the impulse behind it was real, and the practice it described, the deliberate management of the royal image, was very much a feature of Elizabeth's reign. The portraits of Elizabeth that hang in museums today are not candid images. They are constructed representations produced under conditions of royal oversight intended to communicate specific things about the Queen's power, her virtue, and her continuity. And as Elizabeth aged, as the decades passed, and the face became harder to reconcile with the portrait's ageless image, the management became more intense. There are accounts from the later years of her reign of courtiers who were careful about what they said in Elizabeth's presence regarding age or death or the passage of time. These were not merely polite omissions, they were political calculations. The Queen's image was so central to the functioning of the court that anything that undermined it, any reminder of mortality, of aging, of the inevitable gap between the icon and the person, it was managed away. The term mask of youth, which historians used to describe the artistic convention that emerged in Elizabeth's later portraits, refers to this. The faces in these final portraits are not realistic. They are iconic. The skin is white and smooth, the features composed and still, the age entirely removed from them. The woman who was 60, 65, 68 years old in life appears in these paintings as ageless, a symbol rather than a person. Whether that symbolic face was achieved in paint by the portrait painters, or whether it was achieved in Ceruse and Fucus on the actual face before the sitting began, or whether it was some combination of both, that is the historical uncertainty we've already discussed. What is not uncertain is the intent. The intent was to present a face that was unchanged, that the queenship had not aged, that the power was as complete and as vital as it had ever been. It was, in its way, the same project as the mourning ritual of any courtwoman, the same gap between the face in the mirror and the face the world needed to see, the same work of closing that gap, using whatever means were available, simply conducted at the level of the monarchy with the resources of the state, for stakes that were, in the most literal sense, national. And when the foreign ambassadors came to court in those final years, representing the kings and princes of Europe who might be considering Elizabeth as an ally or an adversary, what they saw was managed. The access was managed. The lighting was managed. The distance at which the Queen was seen was managed. The women who surrounded her were chosen and arranged. The whole encounter was, in a very precise sense, a production. One ambassador, visiting in the 1590s, wrote back to his master that the Queen appeared in excellent health and remarkable vigour. He may have been telling the truth. He may have been telling the diplomatic truth, the truth that serves a purpose. The historical record does not always let us distinguish between the two. What is clear is that the production was successful for as long as it was maintained. The image of Elizabeth as the eternal Virgin Queen, ageless, unmarried, sufficient unto herself, England embodied in a woman's form, persisted through the final years of her reign right up to the end. The face in the Mask of Youth portraits is the face England chose to remember. Elizabeth died in 1603. She was 69 years old, a remarkable age for any person of that era, let alone for someone who had survived smallpox at 30, navigated 4 decades of political turbulence, and been the target of multiple assassination plots. Whatever role her daily cosmetic routine played in her eventual decline, it is clear that she was not a woman diminished by the choices she made at her dressing table. She was, by almost any measure, one of the most formidable political operators in English history. But the standard she set, or embodied, or was used to represent, outlasted her. The ideal face of Tudor England persisted into the Stuart period. The dressing table remained the same. The pot of white ceruse remained on it. What changed, over time, was everything around the makeup. Because the makeup, we have established, covered the face, but the face was not the only surface that required attention. Let us return to you. It is still that same morning. The ceruse is on your face, the fucus dried on your lips. The candle has burned down considerably, perhaps a third of it gone already, and you have not yet left the dressing table, because you are not finished, not even close. The face was only the beginning. Let's start at the top, at the forehead, because in Tudor England the forehead was not simply the space between the eyebrows and the hairline. It was, in a very specific sense, a statement. A high, broad, expansive forehead was the Elizabethan mark of intelligence, of breeding, of a mind that was fine enough to deserve a generous frame. The ideal forehead, the one you see in the portraits, in the miniatures, in the paintings that survive, goes on and on. It is a pale, uninterrupted expanse that makes the face seem to begin very high and end very far down. It communicates something before a single word is spoken, but nature does not always cooperate. And so, if your hairline began where the world decided it should not, too low, too close to the eyebrows, leaving you with what was considered an insufficiently noble brow, you dealt with it. You plucked. Not just a few stray hairs, not merely tidying. Tudor women who were serious about their hairline moved it, sometimes by a full inch or more, with tweezers or thread or a preparation of walnut oil applied repeatedly to the skin to discourage new growth. The process was not fast. It was not painless. But the result? A forehead that seemed to extend upward without interruption, giving the face an openness and an elevation that the period considered beautiful, was considered worth it. And while you were at the hairline, you attended to the eyebrows. The ideal Elizabethan eyebrow was thin, very thin, sometimes almost absent, a faint arch, barely there, like a question mark drawn lightly in pencil, and then mostly erased. Some women removed their eyebrows almost entirely. Some shaped them into a precise, extremely narrow line. The effect, combined with the high hairline, was a face with an extraordinary amount of unbroken white space. Forehead above, cheeks below, with only the dark eyes interrupting the pale field. It is a look that takes some adjusting to in a modern eye. But within the aesthetic logic of Tudor England, it was coherent and deliberate, and considered a mark of refinement. The eyebrow that was too thick, too natural, too ungroomed, that was the eyebrow of a woman who had not made sufficient effort, and insufficient effort at court was noticed. Your hair, meanwhile, required its own attention. The Tudor ideal, as it happened, was red gold, the royal colour, the colour of Elizabeth's hair, whether naturally achieved or, as some historians suspect, significantly enhanced, was the aspirational shade for women who wanted to signal their alignment with the court and its values. Warm, vivid, almost amber in certain lights, not the dark brown or black hair that many women were born with. Something brighter, something that caught the candlelight and held it. Women who weren't born with this colour tried to achieve it. The methods were various. A mixture of saffron and sulphur was one approach. Sulphur for its bleaching quality, saffron for the golden warmth it could add. Urine, specifically the aged urine that had been left to concentrate, was another bleaching agent, applied to the hair and left in sun or by the fire to work. The results were unpredictable, the process was not comfortable, and the smell required significant quantities of rosewater, that redemptive scent that appears everywhere in this story, to cover everything that Tudor beauty demanded you to endure. Women who couldn't achieve the colour through chemistry used wigs, and wigs were everywhere in Elizabethan England. Human hair, horsehair, elaborate constructions of fibre and wire that could be shaped and dressed and pinned in ways that natural hair, with its inconvenient tendency to grow in one direction and stay there, could not. Elizabeth herself was said to own a significant collection of wigs, which allowed her to present a consistent image of red gold vitality long after her natural hair had aged beyond it. And if you needed to excuse the wig, if the necessity of removing one's natural hair to wear a hairpiece was something that required covering over, a shaved head beneath a close-fitting wig cap was a perfectly practical solution. Some women shaved their heads, not as an act of grief or shame as it might have been in other contexts, but as a purely practical adaptation to the requirements of an elaborate hairpiece wardrobe. You're sitting at the dressing table now, and the morning has gone considerably further than you expected. The room is fully lit, the household is moving around you, and you are still here, still working, still attending to the face and the hair and the hairline and the eyebrows, because each part of this ritual has its own demands and its own time. There is one more thing, and this one, I should warn you, is the detail that consistently stops people most completely. The one that earns the longest pause: blackened teeth. In Elizabethan England, particularly in the decades of Elizabeth's own reign, black teeth were considered a marker of status, not tolerated as a sign of neglect, not hidden as a source of shame, but actively associated with wealth and high social standing. The reason is straightforward once you know it. Sugar was expensive. Refined sugar, the white processed kind that rots teeth with particular efficiency, was a luxury product available primarily to those who could afford to buy it in quantity. Black teeth meant you ate enough sugar to have damaged your teeth. They were, in the most direct sense, proof of abundance. There are accounts of foreign visitors to the English court in this period who were struck by this, who noted with some puzzlement that the most fashionable women at the most powerful court in England were smiling at them with blackened teeth, apparently with no embarrassment at all. The embarrassment in their world would have run the other direction. A mouthful of undamaged white teeth was the mouth of someone who couldn't afford the sugar, and in a court where appearance was a constant competition, that was not a position anyone was eager to occupy. So the smile at the Tudor court was a black one. You sit back from the dressing table. The candle is burning low. Nearly spent, actually, the flame guttering softly at the base of the stub. The light in the room has changed around it. The face in the metal mirror is composed, arranged, achieved. White ceruse, cinnabar red, the high hairline, the arched brow, the hair dressed over the frame of wire and horsehair into its appointed shape. You are, by the standards of your world, presentable, correct, and the morning has cost you perhaps 2 hours, perhaps 3. There is something in that particular weight, the weight of a 2-hour morning every morning, for the years of your adult life, that stays with me. Not as a criticism of the women who did it. They had no better options. But as a reminder of how much time, how much attention, how much of a life can be absorbed by the simple requirement of appearing correctly in the world. And all of that time, all of that careful work, was recorded, passed down, written into the recipe books that circulated through households the way important knowledge has always travelled, through women, hand to hand, generation to generation. Those books are where we're going next, because they reveal something about Tudor women that the dressing table alone cannot show. There is a particular kind of book that appears in the households of Tudor and Elizabethan England. Not a novel, not a religious text, not a political tract, but something harder to categorize. Historians call them receipt books or books of secrets. The women who kept them probably called them simply their book, their household book, the collection. They are physical objects, these surviving volumes, some printed, some handwritten, some a combination of both, where a printed foundation has been annotated and amended and expanded in the margins and on the blank pages until the printed text has become almost secondary to the accumulation of personal additions. They are worn. They show the evidence of regular use, the pages most frequently consulted gone soft at the edges, stained by the things they describe. They are working documents, not keepsakes, and they contain everything. Cookery, of course, recipes for pies, for preserves, for broths and puddings, for the management of a kitchen through the seasons, medicine, remedies for coughs, for fevers, for childbirth, for the ailments of children and animals and aging joints, household management, how to clean a particular kind of stain, how to keep moths from the good woolens, how to prepare a room for a particular kind of guest, and beauty, always beauty woven through the rest on whatever pages remained, in whatever hands had access to the book over the years. What makes these books remarkable? What makes them a different kind of historical document than the pamphlets and the treatises and the official records that historians more usually rely on, is that they were made by women, for women to be used. They were not written for an audience. They were not composed for posterity. They were written to be consulted at the dressing table, in the kitchen, in the still room where herbs and preparations were mixed and stored. They were practical in the most complete sense of the word, and that practicality is what makes them revealing. Because a woman who writes a beauty recipe in her household book is not trying to impress anyone. She's trying to solve a problem. She is writing down what works, what she has tested, what she has received from someone she trusted and found to be effective and judged worth recording for the next time, or for the daughter who would eventually inherit the book, the way one inherits furniture or silver, as something useful, as a piece of the world's knowledge, carefully kept. Sir Hugh Platt's Delights for Ladies, published in 1602, is the most widely known of the printed versions of this tradition, a guide that circulated beyond any single household, that was bought and added to and passed around. But the recipe books that weren't published, the ones that stayed within families, the ones that survive in archive collections today, are in some ways more telling, because they are not curated for a general reader. They are not shaped by the judgment of a printer or a market. They are simply what women knew, and what they knew included ceruse. It included Mercury preparations. It included, alongside the rosewater and the egg whites and the crushed almonds, the more dangerous materials that the dressing table required, not hidden, not apologized for, simply present, in the same hand, on the same page as the recipe for a burn remedy or a cough syrup. And here is the thing that these books make unmistakably clear, if you spend time with them, the thing that should change the way we talk about Tudor women and their relationship to the dangerous products on their dressing tables. These women were not passive. They were not simply following instructions handed to them by men or by tradition, with no understanding of what they were doing or why. The household books, the way they are organized, annotated, and refined over generations, show women who were active, intelligent experimenters, women who noted when something worked differently than expected, who added their own observations in the margins, who modified a received recipe based on what they had learned from their own experience, who sometimes noted that a particular ingredient should be used sparingly, or not on sensitive skin, or not combined with a certain other preparation. They were by necessity chemists, herbalists, applied scientists working within the constraints of a world that did not offer them formal scientific training, but that absolutely required them to have practical chemical knowledge. The still room, the room in a larger household where preparations were made, was a laboratory in everything but name. The women who worked in it understood materials, reactions, concentrations, and effects, genuinely impressive when you examine what they were actually doing. The recipe books also moved. A preparation that was successful in one household found its way to another, through a visiting friend, through a letter, through a daughter who married into a new family and brought her mother's book or a copy of its most useful pages. Information travelled the way information has always travelled through communities that lack formal institutions, through trust, through relationship, through the quiet networks of women who shared what they knew, because sharing was how you survived. And sometimes what they shared was a warning, not always, not consistently. But sometimes in the margins of a receipt book, or in the careful phrasing of a recipe, you find evidence that the women using these materials were not entirely without awareness of their risks. A note that a preparation should not be used too frequently, an instruction to apply it only to certain areas of the face, an alternative offered alongside the more dangerous option. Here is the gentler version, if the stronger one proves too harsh. These are the notes of people who are paying attention, who are learning from what they observe. It would be too much to say that Tudor women fully understood the mechanism of lead poisoning or mercury toxicity in the modern sense. They did not have that knowledge, and it would be wrong to project it backward, but it would be equally wrong, and considerably less accurate, to say they were oblivious to the effects of what they used. The evidence in the recipe book suggests something more nuanced, a practical awareness, a sense that these materials needed to be handled with care, even without a complete understanding of why. These were not foolish women. They were not vain in the shallow, dismissive sense. They were women navigating a world with the tools their world provided, doing so with more intelligence, more care, and more sophistication than they are usually given credit for. Let me give you a sense of what it was like to read one of these books. Not a paraphrase of the contents, but something closer to the actual experience of holding one, because the language of the recipe books is distinctive, and it carries something that a modern paraphrase can't fully convey. A typical beauty entry might read something like this: "Take of white lead, finely ground so much as will lie on a silver spoon, and mix with rose water until it is smooth as cream. Apply with a soft cloth to the face, taking care to work it evenly into every part, and let it dry before you go into company. If the skin be tender, use less of the lead and more of the water." The tone is practical, unhurried, expert. It reads like advice from someone who has done this many times, who knows the texture of the mixture at the right consistency, who has learned from experience what happens when you use too much. There is nothing alarming in the language, nothing that would cause you, encountering it cold, to set it down. It reads the way a recipe for pastry reads, as competent instruction from a competent person, to a reader assumed to be equally competent. And beside it, in the same book, in the same handwriting, or in a different hand, added years later by a daughter who has inherited the book, might be a recipe for a water to ease the eyes, made from rose petals and rainwater and a little honey, safe, gentle, harmless. And beside that, a receipt for the treatment of a cough, and beside that, the household account for the week's groceries, all of it in one book, all of it in one life. The recipe book is the dressing table, made portable. It is the knowledge of how to maintain a life in the world, how to feed people, how to tend the sick, how to manage the body against its environment, and how to present a face that the world will accept. It is, in its way, a complete theory of survival, one you might recognize in structure if not in content, written in the practical language of a practical person who has no interest in theory and every interest in getting things right. There is something in that, in the image of a woman annotating her recipe book by candlelight, adding a note in the margin of a Ceruse recipe, thinking about the next person who would read these pages, that I keep returning to. It's a small image, but it carries something large. A woman in the middle of a practice we might now read as self-harm, exercising judgment, paying attention, leaving a record. These books were not just collections of knowledge, they were acts of care, extended forward in time, gifts to daughters and granddaughters who hadn't yet been born. You are, in a small sense, one of the people they were extended toward. And all of that knowledge, all of that accumulated, tested, carefully preserved understanding of the dressing table and its requirements could not protect every woman who used it. Because knowing how to use these materials more skillfully is not the same as using them safely. And there are women in this story who paid the full price of the products on their table in ways that their own era recognized and named. The most famous of them came not from the Tudor court itself, but from the generations that followed it, a time when the practices were the same, and the standards were similar, and the social pressures had not diminished. A time when the dressing table still held the same small white pot. Her name was Maria Gunning. Not every woman in this story is a queen or a courtier or a historical figure who shaped events. Some of the most important figures in any story are the ones who simply lived, who were ordinary people in the terms of their own world, and who became significant only in retrospect, only because their story was visible enough to survive. Maria Gunning was not ordinary, but she was not Elizabeth either. She was something in between. Let me introduce you to her properly, a woman whose beauty became her defining characteristic in the eyes of the world around her, and whose story, in the end, became an illustration of everything we've been discussing tonight. She was born in Ireland in 1732, into a family that was genteel in aspiration if not always in resources. She and her sister Elizabeth, both striking, both possessed of the kind of looks that attracted notice in public spaces, came to London in the early 1750s and promptly became the talk of the city. This was not a mild or passing attention. People gathered in the streets when they went out. The parks became crowded when word spread that the Gunning sisters were walking there. Their faces were painted, engraved, and sold as prints to a public that couldn't see enough of them. Maria married the Earl of Coventry in 1752. She was 20 years old. She became the Countess of Coventry, a title that gave her the social position her looks had always seemed to promise, and she moved into the full-dress performance of aristocratic English life, with all of its requirements and all of its visibility, and she was very serious about her appearance. The sources from her own lifetime describe a woman who applied her cosmetics with considerable dedication. Ceruse for the white mask, rouge for the colour, the full daily ritual that we've been describing, applied to a face that the world was already watching with extraordinary attention. Some accounts suggest her husband objected to the practice, that he was aware of the damage the makeup was doing and tried, at various points, to discourage it. Others suggest she was too embedded in the social world she inhabited to step away from the standards it demanded. Both things may be true simultaneously. Most situations are more complicated than a single explanation. What is clear, what you can trace in the sources, is that her health declined. Gradually, over the years of her marriage, the brightness that had attracted such attention in her early 20s dimmed. By her late 20s, she was visibly unwell, the kind of unwell that the people around her noticed and commented on, that was visible in her face and her manner and her energy. In 1760, she died. She was 27 years old. Her contemporaries gave her death a name. They called it death by vanity. Newspapers of the period made the connection explicitly. This was a woman, they said, who had been killed by her cosmetics, by the daily application of lead and mercury to a face that the world had made it impossible for her to leave unadorned. The phrase death by vanity was not a private expression of grief. It was a public verdict. Her story was told as a cautionary tale in the most literal sense of the term within her own lifetime and in the decades immediately following her death. Here the honest historian in me needs to say something. Modern historians have noted that tuberculosis, which was prevalent and which caused symptoms that could look, at a distance, very similar to the slow decline of lead and mercury poisoning, may also have been a factor in Maria Gunning's death. The cause is not as cleanly documented as the popular account suggests. She may have died of a combination of things, as people in the 18th century so often did, from a convergence of health challenges that no one had the tools to fully untangle. But here is what is not in doubt. Her own era told her story as a story about beauty's cost. They saw what happened to her, they knew about her cosmetics, and they connected the two. The verdict of death by vanity was not a later invention. It was the contemporary reading of a contemporary life, and that contemporary reading, the fact that the people around her thought this was happening and said so, is itself historically significant regardless of what the exact medical truth may have been. Because what you should understand, looking at Maria Gunning's story from this distance, is what it represents. Whether or not the Ceruse was the sole cause, she was the named version of a pattern that was almost certainly much more common than the historical record shows. She was visible, she was famous, she was watched, and so when she died, her death was attributed, recorded, discussed. The countless women who died younger than they should have, in households without titles, in circumstances without public attention. Their deaths were not attributed to anything. They were simply deaths. The pattern they formed was invisible because no one was looking for it, or because the people who were looking didn't think it counted enough to write down. Maria Gunning became the cautionary tale because she was famous enough to have a tale told about her. But she was not the exception. She was the visible face of a much larger, quieter loss. She would not have thought of herself as a cautionary tale. She was simply trying to be the thing her world told her she needed to be. That's the detail that stays with me when I think about her. Not the tragedy of it exactly, though it is tragic, but the complete ordinariness of the decision, the morning ritual, the dressing table, the small white pot opened again, and tonight, from wherever you are, settled in the warmth of your bed, the room around you soft and still. I want to bring you back to that dressing table one more time, because there is something in that image I'm not ready to leave behind just yet. Let me tell you a little more about what that morning ritual was actually protecting against. Because we have talked about the dressing table, and the products on it, and the social expectations that made them necessary. But we haven't quite talked about what happened when you fell short. What the cost of an inadequate appearance actually was in practical terms in the day-to-day life of Tudor and Elizabethan England. The consequences weren't announced. Nobody said to a woman formally that her complexion was insufficient. Tudor England was not that blunt. What happened instead was subtler, and in some ways more complete. A woman who appeared at court or in company without the full maintenance of the expected standard found herself subject to the quiet machinery of social judgment, which operated continuously and without apology. She was looked past rather than looked at. Conversation shifted in her direction slightly less often. Invitations arrived a little more slowly or not at all. The women around her who had made the full effort signalled their own status partly by contrast. The more complete the performance, the sharper the implicit critique of a less complete one. It was not cruel, exactly. It was simply the logic of a social system in which appearance was information, and women who didn't broadcast the right information were read very efficiently as people of limited importance. And at court, limited importance had consequences you could measure. It measured in the length of an audience with a patron, in the warmth or coolness of a greeting from someone whose favour mattered, in the marriage negotiations that opened or didn't open, the household positions that were offered or passed over, the small daily transactions of a world organised around reputation and rank. The stakes were not identical for every woman. A great lady, securely married to a powerful man, had considerably more room to let her appearance slip than a woman who was younger or less established, or whose position depended on the goodwill of people she needed to impress. But even great ladies understood that the dressing table was not optional, because great ladies had daughters, and the appearance of the mother reflected in the eyes of that world on the prospects of the daughter. The standards were maintained not only for one's own sake, but for the sake of the people whose futures were attached to one's own. All of which means that the woman at the dressing table in the morning was not doing something trivial or private. She was performing a task with real social stakes, real practical implications, and a real cost if she performed it inadequately, and she knew this. The knowledge was in the air of her world, absorbed early, never quite stated but thoroughly understood. Now, I want to stay with the physical experience of all this for a moment, because we've talked about what Ceruse looked like, and what it was made of, and what it did to the skin over time, but we haven't quite talked about what it was like to wear it through a real day at court with its particular demands. The ceruse was applied in the morning, cooled from the pot, smooth, covering everything, and then you went about your day in it. Through the morning's business, through meals, through whatever ceremonies or entertainments the court day offered, in rooms that were heated by fire in winter and close and warm in summer, in company pressed in among other people, the candles burning even in daylight because the great rooms were often shadowed. Lead white does not like heat. It does not like sweat. Under warm conditions, and the rooms of a court were often warm, crowded rooms full of people and candle flame and the accumulated heat of formal dress, the ceruse could begin to shift, to crack slightly at the edges of expression, to lose its smooth uniform surface in the creases where the face moved. A woman who laughed openly, or whose expression was mobile and expressive, faced the particular challenge of a face that was trying to express itself through a medium that preferred stillness. You learn to manage your expression accordingly, to move the face carefully, conservatively, in ways that preserve the surface, to laugh with a particular restraint, to avoid the unguarded animation that would show as cracking in the mask, which is, when you think about it, an additional cost of a kind we haven't mentioned. The cost not just to the body, but to the expressiveness of the person inside the body. The mask didn't only sit on the face, it shaped subtly the movements of it, and the smell. The rosewater was generous and present, but underneath it, in the warmth of a crowded room, In the heat of the afternoon, the other smell was there too, the faint metallic edge that the lead gave off. Not unpleasant exactly, not at the quantities applied to a face, but present, persistent. A ghost of a smell beneath the sweetness that people who were very close, who leaned in for a greeting, who sat at the same table, might catch if they were paying attention. The evening, when it finally arrived, brought the ritual of removal. Cloth soaked in the Mercury wash, pressed to the face and worked in circles. The ceruse coming away in pale smears on the cloth. The skin underneath, reddened perhaps from the day's application, or drier than it had been that morning. Sometimes a rash, sometimes a roughness, sometimes simply the skin looking tired in a way it hadn't looked the morning before. And here is the thing about lead poisoning that makes it so particularly insidious in this context. The symptoms it causes are not dramatic. They are not the symptoms of an obvious recognizable illness. They are the symptoms of aging, of a life being lived, of a body doing the normal things that bodies do over time, just faster and worse and sooner than they should. Hair that thins and comes away more easily than it once did. If you'd asked any Tudor woman about this, she would have called it aging, or worry, or the consequence of illness or childbirth. Lead poisoning does exactly this. It accelerates the thinning of hair. But there was no way in the 16th or 17th century to distinguish the lead's contribution from the contribution of everything else. Skin that loses its elasticity, that develops a greyish undertone, that ages visibly faster than it should, this was understood as the normal course of a woman's complexion over time. Some women aged more gracefully than others. It was thought to be a matter of constitution, of luck, of how one had lived. That lead was accelerating the process, actively degrading the structures beneath the surface. There was no framework available to see it. A mind that grows occasionally foggy, that loses the thread of a conversation, that finds certain words harder to retrieve than they once were, that is sometimes slower than it feels it should be. This was exhaustion, anxiety, the demands of a complicated life. Chronic lead poisoning damages the brain, gradually at sustained low doses. But the Tudor period had no way of identifying that specific damage as distinct from all the other things that made a person feel, sometimes, not quite themselves. Tremors in the hands, weakness in the grip, pain in the joints that arrived before it seemed like it should. Each of these was its own small medical mystery, understood through the frameworks of the period. Bad humours, imbalances in the body's constitution, the consequences of grief or cold or the wrong diet. Each was treated separately, with the remedies of the era. None was understood as part of a pattern, and so a woman could be poisoned by the very table you've been watching her sit at each morning of this story, slowly and systematically, and experience the poisoning as nothing more specific than the general difficulty of living in a body that was aging in a demanding world. She would have had no reason to connect the white pot on the dressing table to the tiredness in her hands. The connection simply wasn't available to be made. This is the part of the story that I find genuinely difficult to carry lightly. Not the drama of it. There is no single dramatic moment in this story, no clear villain, no sharp catastrophe. It is a story made entirely of ordinary mornings, ordinary small decisions, ordinary women sitting at ordinary dressing tables, opening ordinary pots, doing what the world had told them was necessary. And the harm accumulating so slowly, so quietly, that it was indistinguishable from life itself. What we know now, What modern medicine lets us see looking backward is that the symptoms documented in the medical records of upper-class Tudor and Elizabethan women are, in retrospect, consistent with chronic heavy metal exposure. Hair loss documented, neurological symptoms documented, skin deterioration documented. The records are not proof because the records predate the understanding, but they are consistent. The pattern is there for someone who knows to look for it. And the women whose symptoms are most consistently documented are, not coincidentally, the ones who are most consistently described in other sources as taking particular care with their appearance. The connection was not made at the time. It is the connection we make now, looking back, with everything we know. And it carries a particular kind of weight, because these were not reckless women. They were not foolish. They were not making careless choices about their bodies. They were doing what their world told them was right, what their mothers had done, what the women they admired at court were doing, what the recipe books endorsed and the social machinery demanded. They were, in the fullest and most heartbreaking sense, doing everything correctly, and it was killing them, slowly and quietly, and in ways that looked, from inside the experience, like nothing more significant than getting older. The candle burns a little lower. The morning at the dressing table is almost over. The day is waiting. And there is one more thing I want to tell you about how far down the social ladder these practices actually travelled, because we have been talking mostly about court women, about ladies and countesses and the women in Elizabeth's orbit, and it would be easy to assume that the Ceruse and the Fucus and the Belladonna were confined to that world, that they were the exclusive property of the aristocracy, too expensive and too rarefied for anyone outside the court circle. They were not. The aspiration travelled. The standards set at court radiated outward, as standards always do, through the social layers beneath it. Women who were nowhere near court, who had never set foot in a royal palace, who were wives of merchants and minor gentry and prosperous tradespeople, these women also kept recipe books, also mixed their own preparations, also applied what they could afford of the same general category of products, using the same general principles, in pursuit of the same general standard. The quality varied. The genuine Venetian Ceruse was an aristocratic luxury, but white lead itself was available, in less refined forms, mixed with less care, producing results that were less smooth and less reliable, but available. Women who couldn't afford the genuine article found workarounds. Cheaper preparations, homemade versions, the recipes passed between households that might use less expensive base materials. The Mercury Rouge was similarly widespread in its lower quality iterations. The Belladonna was a plant, and plants grew in gardens. The knowledge of how to use them circulated through the same recipe book networks that circulated everything else a woman needed to know. So the damage was not confined to the court. It spread through the social body along the same channels that the aspiration spread. A woman in a cheapside merchant's household, applying her homemade ceruse in the grey morning light of a London autumn, was participating in the same system as the lady at court. The ingredients were less refined. The consequences were the same, and knowing this, knowing that it wasn't only queens and countesses, but women across a whole society, across decades, each one making the same small morning decision at her own small dressing table, changes the scale of what we're talking about. This wasn't a court curiosity. It was a widespread practice, embedded in the daily life of women at almost every level of respectable English society for well over 100 years. All those dressing tables, all those mornings, all those candles, the small white pot, opened again and again, in rooms from Whitehall to Cheapside to the quiet parlours of the provincial gentry. The price paid, in aggregate, is one we'll never fully calculate, because most of those women left no record, no famous story, no newspaper verdict, just the ordinary mathematics of lives that may have been shorter and harder and more diminished than they should have been. The quiet arithmetic of a world that asked too much and offered too little, and that never, not once, considered changing the standard instead of the women. Come back to the dressing table one more time, the candle on it, the small warm circle of light, the face in the mirror waiting to be constructed for the day. She opens the pot, the morning begins, and I want to go back with you just a little further into the world of that pot, into the process of what it took to produce the thing that sat on that dressing table. Because the making of Ceruse is a story in itself, and it illuminates something about the world that used it that the product alone doesn't quite convey. White lead, the base of Ceruse, was not produced in a factory in the modern sense. It was produced through a process called corrosion, and it was produced in quantity in various parts of Europe, with England importing much of its supply from the continent. Venice, which gave Venetian Ceruse its name, was one major source. The Netherlands was another. The process involved stacking sheets of metallic lead above containers of vinegar, the acetic acid vapours rising to meet the metal, and leaving them in conditions of warmth and humidity for a period of weeks. The slow corrosion of the lead surface by the acid produced a crust of white lead carbonate, which was then scraped off, refined, and processed into the final product. This was done on an industrial scale in some places and on a very small scale in others. Women who made their own ceruse at home, and the recipe books show that some did, were doing a version of this same process in their own still rooms, often without fully understanding the chemistry, but understanding the procedure precisely. The recipes describe it accurately, even if the language is the language of practical craft rather than chemistry. Heat and acid and time. The materials working on each other in the way the recipe says they will. The result that appears, if you follow the instructions, as predictable as bread. The alchemical tradition gave this process a particular metaphorical richness that Tudor readers would have recognized immediately. Lead, in alchemy, was Saturn, the heaviest of the 7 metals, the slowest, the most associated with melancholy and time and the deep, patient processes of transformation. The planet Saturn governed aging and heaviness, and the kind of change that happens very slowly and cannot be stopped. This was the astrological tradition that Tudor England took seriously. Spirits of Saturn applied to the face. This was not merely a product name. It was, for a mind shaped by the metaphysical assumptions of the era, a description of what was actually happening. Saturn's work applied to the surface of the body. The irony of that the metal of aging was the primary ingredient of the product meant to conceal aging, was either invisible to Tudor cosmetic culture, or was simply accepted as one of the paradoxes that the world contains. Saturn works in both directions. He erases time from the surface while simultaneously advancing it beneath. Now, let me take you somewhere that the dressing table in isolation doesn't quite let you see. Because the dressing table, as we've been picturing it, is a private space. A woman alone in a room in the early morning, the candle lit, the house not yet fully awake. And for many women, particularly in smaller households, that is exactly what the morning ritual was: private, quiet, personal. But for women at court, particularly for women in close proximity to the Queen, the ladies in waiting, the women of the bedchamber, the morning ritual was something different. It was semi-public, a social occasion in itself. The dressing rooms of great houses and palaces were not solitary spaces. They were rooms where ladies gathered, where the mistress of the household or the highest-ranking woman in the chamber received her women around her as she dressed. Ladies-in-waiting helped with the more elaborate aspects of the toilette, the hair, the lacing of garments, the arrangement of accessories. They passed the cloths, held the mirror at a better angle, fetched the particular preparation that was needed from the shelf. They were present. They were watching. They were in the process of helping, witnessing. This meant that the morning ritual was also a performance, not for the court at large, not for the public spaces of the palace, but for the small audience of women who were close enough to see the full process. How a woman conducted herself at her dressing table, the efficiency and confidence of it, the quality of her preparations, the skillfulness of the application, this was visible, and it was judged quietly by the women who watched. It also meant that the cosmetic knowledge of the court circulated in these rooms, a preparation that worked well, a new recipe obtained from a visiting lady, a technique for achieving a better result with the same materials. This was the conversation of the dressing room. The beauty knowledge of Tudor court women travelled horizontally, through direct observation and direct conversation, in these semi-public morning gatherings, and it meant that the pain and the inconvenience and the tedium of the ritual, the stinging of a Mercury wash, the discomfort of the hairline plucking, the long still minutes of waiting for Ceruse to set, were shared, witnessed, normalized. When the women around you are also submitting to the same process, the process stops feeling like an unusual sacrifice. It simply becomes what mornings are. There is one more dimension of this story I want to put in front of you, because we have been talking almost entirely about what women did and why they did it, and that is correct. The story is theirs. But the standards they were meeting were not set by them, and the people who set those standards deserve at least a moment of direct examination. The beauty ideal of Tudor England, the pale face, the white ceruse, the particular architecture of the ideal female appearance, was produced by a world in which men wrote the poetry, controlled the marriages, managed the households, and held the social power that determined what women needed to look like to navigate their lives successfully. The men at court were not applying ceruse. The men at court were not plucking their hairlines or bleaching their hair with sulphur and urine. The men at court were the audience for whom the performance was, in significant part, staged. This is not a simple accusation. The relationship between beauty standards and the gaze of men is one that historians have written about with care and nuance, and it deserves care and nuance here too. The women at Tudor court were not simply passive subjects of a male aesthetic that they had no hand in creating. They were active participants in a system. They set standards for each other. They enforced expectations among themselves. They took pride in their expertise and their knowledge and their skill at the dressing table. The social machinery was not simply imposed from outside. It was maintained from within by the women who inhabited it. And yet, the underlying arrangement, the one that determined that it was women who needed to maintain a particular appearance to have social worth, and men who had worth independent of their appearance, that arrangement was not neutral. It was not a natural fact about the world. It was a social structure, made by the decisions of people with power, and its costs were not shared equally by those people. The women bore the physical cost of the beauty standard. The men, for the most part, did not. It is worth saying plainly, even if it's not the most comfortable thing to say in the middle of a quiet history story at this hour of the night. The dressing table was not simply a woman's choice. It was a woman's obligation in a world she'd had very little hand in designing. and the people who benefited most from that obligation, who moved through social spaces relying on the presented faces of the women around them, who negotiated marriages based on the appearance of daughters who had spent 2 hours achieving it, those people bore remarkably little of the cost. The small white pot on the dressing table, the candle beside it, the women who opened it, the world that made it necessary. Both things are true at once, and neither one cancels the other out. And England, I should tell you, was not alone in this, because we've been in one country, in one court, following one set of recipe books and one queen, and one particular tradition. But the practices we've been describing were European in their scope. The Ceruse, the Mercury Rouge, the Belladonna. These were not English inventions. They were part of a cosmetic tradition that stretched across Catholic Europe, from Italy northward into France and Spain and the Low Countries, and that England had inherited partly through trade and partly through the cultural exchanges of the Renaissance. Italy had been here first, as you might expect given everything we've covered. The Italian courts of the 15th century, the Medicis, the Sforzas, the great houses of Venice and Florence and Milan, had developed the cosmetic practices that Tudor England adopted, refined, and made its own. The Italian humanist tradition had its own complex relationship with female beauty, on one hand celebrating it in poetry and painting, on the other hand producing moral treatises that warned against its pursuit. It was a contradiction the Elizabethan court would have recognized completely. Both things were true in Italy too. Venice, in particular, was famous across Europe for the extreme beauty practices of its noble women. Venetian women bleached their hair in the sun. They used a hat, wide brim, hole in the crown, through which the hair was spread out and left to bake, sometimes for hours, while the woman sat on a rooftop terrace, face carefully shaded. They used ceruse, they used fucus, they used elaborate hairpieces. They were so famous for the deliberate architectural quality of their beauty that foreign visitors to Venice wrote about it with the same mixture of admiration and slightly scandalized fascination that foreign visitors to the English court brought to the subject of black teeth. In France, the cosmetic practices were similar in kind, if different in particular emphasis. The French court under Catherine de' Medici, who was herself Italian, who'd come to France as a bride at 14 and brought her cosmetic knowledge with her, developed its own elaborations of the Ceruse tradition. Catherine has been credited by some later writers with introducing various cosmetic practices to France. The historical reality is considerably more complicated than a single person importing a single tradition. What is clear is that the French court of the 16th century was as invested in the maintenance of the ideal face as the English court, and used many of the same materials to achieve it. Spain was similar. The Holy Roman Empire was similar. The ideal of white skin as the marker of noble status, the use of lead-based cosmetics to achieve it, the mercury preparations, the general architecture of the expected aristocratic female face. These were consistent across Catholic European court culture, with variations in emphasis and local preference, but not in fundamental approach. The dressing table you've been watching, the pot, the ceruse, the careful morning ritual was replicated with local variations across an entire continent, which means, if you follow that logic, that the scale we were describing, the widespread, cross-class adoption of these practices in England, applies across an entire continent, not just one island and its court. Europe, for roughly 2 centuries, was applying lead and mercury to the faces of its noble women, its merchant-class women, its aspiring gentry women, its quietly ambitious tradesmen's wives. The aggregate of that exposure, The collected damage done across those 2 centuries, across that geography, is a number no historian has calculated, because the data to calculate it doesn't exist. But it was not small. And then, gradually it changed. The decline of Ceruse as the dominant cosmetic of European court culture was slow and uneven. It didn't end on a particular date. It wasn't abolished by any law or proclamation. It didn't stop because the medical warnings finally reached a critical mass of public attention. It faded over the course of the 17th century and into the 18th. Cosmetic fashions shifted. New materials became available. The specific class signalling that white skin carried began to attach to different markers, and the association between heavy white makeup and theatrical excess gradually became unfashionable in certain circles. By the Georgian period, Maria Gunning century as you'll remember, the heavy white mask was already beginning to seem slightly old-fashioned in some settings. Too much, too theatrical, the mark of someone who hadn't quite absorbed the newer sensibility of studied naturalness that was coming into vogue. Lighter applications, a less extreme whiteness, a face that looked as if it might plausibly be a real face. These began to be valued in certain contexts. The ceruse didn't disappear overnight, but it began to lose its position as the unquestioned default. And as it faded, the botanical alternatives, on which you've already seen in those recipe books, sitting alongside the more dangerous preparations, came into slightly greater favour. There had always been women who preferred the safer options. Rose water, used alone or in combination with egg white and ground almonds, could create a brightening effect on the skin without the toxicity. Honey preparations, herbal infusions, the juice of certain plants known for their mild lightening properties. None of these produced the dramatic, opaque, snow-white result of the ceruse. None of them met the full requirement of the standard at its most demanding, but they were present. They were known. They were, for some women in some circumstances, the choice made. The recipe books contain both, the safer preparations and the dangerous ones side by side, with no particular hierarchy between them. What this tells us is that the choice was available in a limited sense. The safe option existed, and women knew it existed. The question was always whether the safe option met the standard. And in the court world of the Tudor period, at its most demanding, it often did not. The ceruse produced a whiteness that egg white and rose water could not match, and the standard required the whiteness. But in the quieter margins of the same world, the household that was not aspiring to court, the woman who had secured her position and no longer needed to compete at the highest level, the older woman who'd moved past the most intense period of social scrutiny, the botanical preparations found more space. They were what you used when the stakes were lower, when the standard was somewhat less absolute, when your complexion needed maintenance rather than transformation. And here, in this detail, is something genuinely interesting about the history of cosmetics in this period, something that the recipe books reveal about how women thought about their own appearance, and about the difference between what they used when the world was watching and what they used when it wasn't. The household books contain in effect 2 cosmetic traditions operating simultaneously: the public-facing tradition, the ceruse, the fucus, the preparations for being seen, and the private-facing tradition, the rose water, the honey, the gentle botanical preparations that were what you did for your skin when nobody needed to assess it. The private tradition was almost certainly healthier, and it was always there, always available, always part of the knowledge system. It simply wasn't sufficient for the most demanding social situations. And so women moved between them, the gentle preparation in the evening, the more aggressive one in the morning before the day began. the care for the skin in private and the performance of the ideal in public. Both traditions occupying the same recipe book. There is something in that duality that feels, again, contemporary. Not because our products are the same. They are dramatically safer, most of them, and the regulatory landscape around cosmetic safety has changed completely since the early modern period. But the structural duality, the private care and the public performance, the face you tend in quiet and the face you present to the world, that persists. It may always have persisted. It may be one of the more consistent features of the experience of having a face that other people look at. What the historical record actually preserves of these women, the recipe books, the portrait tradition, the occasional letter or diary entry, the court records and the household accounts and the medical pamphlets, is a partial picture. The women who left the most traces were the ones with the most resources, the most proximity to power, the most visibility. Elizabeth I has a vast historical record because Elizabeth was the queen, and queens are documented. Maria Gunning has a historical record because she was famous enough to be written about. The merchant's wife in Cheapside, the gentlewoman in the provincial manor, the lady-in-waiting who served her years at court and then retired to the countryside. These women exist in the record only fleetingly, if at all. Their recipe books, if they survived, are in archives, often uncatalogued. Their symptoms, if they were recorded, appear in the household accounts of physicians who didn't connect them to any single cause. Their faces, if they were painted rarely, and without the deliberate political management that went into royal portraiture. They are there, behind the history. The majority of the women we've been talking about tonight, the unnamed many who make up the actual social reality of the dressing table, and they are mostly silent. But the silence is not emptiness. It's the presence of people whose records didn't survive, whose stories weren't considered important enough to preserve, but who were there, at their own dressing tables, in their own candlelit rooms, opening their own pots, going about the work of being visible in the world they inhabited, paying the cost of it, quietly, in the currency of their own bodies. That is the history we've been sitting with tonight. Not the history of queens, or not only that, the history of all those ordinary mornings, all those small flames burning in all those cold rooms, the pot opened, the day begun. There is one more thread I want to follow with you before we let the dressing table go and settle into the quiet of the night, because we've talked about the cost of these practices, the damage, the slow accumulation of harm in bodies that were doing what the world required of them, and that is the honest centre of this story. But there are also women on the edges of this history who managed to live long lives despite, or perhaps partially because of the botanical alternatives they used alongside or instead of the most toxic preparations. Women who grew old, who survived into what was, for their era, a genuine old age, and their presence in the record is a reminder that the outcome was not uniform, and that the variability of individual bodies matters. Some women were simply less exposed. They used ceruse less frequently, or in smaller quantities, or they happened to use formulations that were less pure, and therefore, paradoxically, less immediately damaging. Some women had bodies that tolerated the lead better, not without harm but with slower accumulation, less severe symptoms at the same levels of exposure. The range of outcomes across the population of ceruse users was wide, and the historical record captures only fragments of it. And some women, we should note, made choices that reduced their exposure. Women who used the botanical preparations as their primary approach and reserved the heavier ceruse for the most demanding public occasions, Women who took the margins of their recipe books seriously, who noted the instructions to use sparingly and followed them. Women who, for reasons of constitution or preference, or a degree of independence from the most competitive social environments, found ways to meet the standard with less of the most dangerous materials. Their faces in old age were probably different from the faces of women who had applied Ceruse daily for 40 years. The recipe book suggests this. The older women who wrote the more careful annotations, who noted the gentler alternatives, who seemed to have lived long enough to have opinions about what sustained use did over time. These are the women who might have seen the full arc of the practice, from the dressing table of their youth to the quieter routines of their later decades, who had watched other women who had used the products more heavily age faster and worse than they had. Their testimony is indirect. They didn't write treatises, they didn't publish their observations. They wrote notes in the margins of recipe books, in a hand that becomes slightly less steady over the decades that the pages span. But the notes are there. Now let me tell you something about the men who wrote about this. Because the literary tradition of Tudor England, the poets, the playwrights, the essayists, the moral writers, had a great deal to say about female beauty and about cosmetics, and their relationship to what they said is more complicated than it might at first appear. The poets celebrated the ideal. Sidney and Spenser, and the whole tradition of Elizabethan love poetry, constructed the ideal beauty in their verse, the white skin, the red lips, the golden hair, in language of extraordinary extravagance. They were, in the most literal sense, writing the standard. The poems that circulated at court described the ideal female face in terms that every woman who read them understood as the target. The poetry was not neutral observation. It was the articulation of demand, and at the same time, sometimes in the very same writers, there was a counter-tradition. Poems and essays that mocked women for using cosmetics, that described the painted face as a deception, a fraud, an attempt to pass off artificial goods as natural ones. That condemned the very practice the beauty standard made necessary, in a kind of double bind that was, for the women caught in it, entirely without a good exit. The poet who wrote that your eyes were like stars and your skin like snow also wrote, or his colleagues did, that a woman who used Ceruse to achieve that skin was a painted whore, a dissembler, a thing of artifice rather than nature. The standard was set in verse, and the means of meeting the standard were condemned in verse, often by the same class of men, sometimes by the same men. The women reading these poems knew, perfectly well, what was being done to them. The recipe books, and the careful notes in the margins, are one form of response. What eventually shifted the standard was not a moral awakening. It was not a medical discovery that finally penetrated the social machinery with enough force to change behavior. What shifted it was fashion. The particular code that attached whiteness to aristocratic worth, that specific equation, so deeply embedded in Tudor and Elizabethan culture, began to loosen in the 17th century as other codes emerged, as the social landscape of England changed with the Civil War and the Restoration, and the gradual shift in who had power and how power expressed itself. The standard didn't disappear. Beauty standards don't disappear. But they evolved, and as they evolved, the specific demand for the white Ceruse mask became less absolute. The dangers, in other words, did not convince anyone to stop. The fashion changed. And when the fashion changed, the product lost its necessity. This is how most cosmetic practices end, not with a discovery but with a trend, not with a prohibition but with an obsolescence. And perhaps there is something clarifying about that. The lesson isn't that beauty standards eventually yield to reason. The lesson is that they yield to other beauty standards. The game continues. The dressing table remains. The specific contents of the pot change. What stays the same, what has stayed the same, as far back as we can see into the historical record, is the basic human situation of having a face that the world will judge, and wanting, with whatever means are available, to present that face in a way that meets the world's requirements. That desire is not foolish. It is not shallow. It is the desire to be recognized, to be seen correctly, to move through social space with the dignity that recognition provides. Every era finds its own version of the dressing table. Every era fills the pot with whatever the standard of the moment requires. The Tudor women who reached for the Ceruse were not different from us in that desire. They were only different in the particular terrible contents of the pot. And what I want to leave you with, as the night gets quieter around you, as the room settles into its small hours, is not the tragedy of it, though it is tragic. It is the humanity of it, the completely ordinary, recognizable, deeply human experience of sitting in front of a mirror and trying to be enough, of finding the gap between who you are and who the world wants you to be, and spending your morning filling it with whatever you have. These women were not strangers. They were not figures from a world so alien that their choices are beyond understanding. They were people, clever, careful, often funny, sometimes frustrated, always navigating, doing the best they could with the world they'd been given. They did not deserve the cost that world imposed on them, and they are worth remembering, not as cautionary tales, not as victims, but as people who got up every morning, lit the candle, sat down at the table, and did what needed to be done. That is, in the end, what most of us do. In different rooms, with different tools, toward different standards, but the same basic act, the same basic courage, the candle, the mirror, the face. History is, in the end, a collection of mornings, not battles and proclamations. Those are the punctuation of it, the marks between the sentences. The substance of it is this: ordinary people in ordinary rooms, doing what the day required of them, mostly without an audience, mostly without any sense that what they were doing would matter to anyone in a later century. The women at the Tudor dressing table did not know they would be remembered. Most of them knew they would not be. They were doing a practical thing, in a practical world, and the meaning of it, the historical weight we give it now, was entirely invisible to them. They were simply getting ready for the day, and that is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about them. They were simply getting ready for the day beginning, the candle on the table still burning. All of it comes back to that dressing table, the small white pot, the metal mirror, the candle throwing its circle of gold across the wood while the house was still quiet and the day had not yet fully arrived. Everything we've talked about tonight, the Ceruse, the Mercury Rouge, the Belladonna, the recipe books, the high hairlines, the arched brows, the 2-hour mornings, all of it happened in that room, in that light, in the quiet before the world made its demands known. And what drove women to that table morning after morning was not a small or shallow thing. It was a world that had decided precisely what they needed to look like, and had attached real consequences to whether or not they complied. The dressing table was not a place of vanity. It was a place of work, of necessary, daily, often costly work. And the women who sat there, who opened the pot, who mixed the paste, who applied the white and the red and reached for the small dark bottle, were doing what their world required of them, with the materials their world provided. They were fluent in a language they had not written. and they paid for that fluency with their health, their time, their skin, and sometimes considerably more. That is not a small thing to sit with. It deserves more than a footnote. What this history teaches, if it teaches anything, is that beauty has never been a private matter. It has always been political, always about who has power, who performs it, and who bears the cost of maintaining the appearance of it. The specific ingredients change across centuries. The underlying arrangement has been remarkably consistent. And now, right now, I want to bring you close, not to the dressing table, to here, to wherever you are tonight. You have your own version of this pressure, not the same one, not with those ingredients. The specific equation of pale skin with social worth has been named and challenged, in ways that Tudor women could not have imagined. The products on your dressing table, if you have one, are not lead and mercury. The stakes are different. The world you're navigating is different in important ways. And yet, the mirror is still there, in some form. The question of what a face is supposed to look like, who decides that, what it costs to maintain it, what you lose if you don't. That question has not been fully answered. Each generation answers it a little differently than the last. Most of them don't entirely realize they're answering it at all. But you don't need to solve any of that tonight. You've just spent the evening with women who did their best with what they had, in the world they inhabited. That's enough. More than enough. Let it be enough. Let the room settle around you now. The bed is beneath you, solid and warm, holding the length of you without effort. You can feel the specific weight of lying still, the way the mattress receives the body and keeps it. The blankets are warm. Not dramatically, not oppressively. Just warm, the way a room gets warm when it's been closed and quiet for a long time. Your shoulders may have been carrying something they don't need to carry tonight. Not with effort, not by trying. Just let them settle, very slightly, a little lower. The pillow is exactly where it needs to be. Your neck is easy. The room around you is exactly as it is. The air is still. There is warmth at your feet, warmth along your sides, warmth where the blanket meets the curve of your shoulders. The body's very good at warmth when it's allowed to stop moving. Somewhere there may be sound, a house settling, the specific near silence of the night in the small hours, the faint presence of the world going on outside. It doesn't need your attention. It's part of the room. You are part of the room. Everything is where it belongs. The hands at your sides, the length of the legs, easy and still. The breath moving in and out without any help from you at all. Just the body doing what bodies know how to do in the quiet. Go back to that room with me. One last time, very gently. The dressing table is there, and the candle is on it. Not the low, nearly spent one from the end of the long morning, but the early one. The candle from the beginning of the day, tall and fresh, its small flame steady in the cold air of a Tudor morning before the world had fully woken. The light it throws is warm, golden in the way that candlelight is always golden, the specific gold of a single flame in a dark room, which is different from any other kind of light. It falls across the wooden surface of the table, across the cloth beneath the white pot, across the faint gleam of the metal mirror. The smell of rosewater, very faint, old and sweet and clean, the way something smells when it has been kept in a quiet place for a long time. A woman sits at the table. You can see her from behind. The dark fabric of her gown, the soft shape of her shoulders, the candle flame reflected very small in the surface of the mirror before her. She is still. The morning is still. The room holds both of them. The candle burns. The flame is steady, not quite motionless. It shifts very slightly, the way all flames do, alive in a way that nothing else in the room is, but mostly still, mostly steady, throwing its small warm light across everything it can reach. The smell of rose water, the stillness of the room, the candle. Your breath has found its own pace. There is nothing you need to do with it. In and out, the body knows. The room breathes with you, at its own slow rhythm. The dark around you is quiet and soft. The dressing table is still there, somewhere in that other morning. The woman at it is still. The candle still burns. It will burn a little longer yet. The breath, in, out. The room is very still. The candle on the dressing table. In a room that is lit by nothing else. The flame barely moving now. Very small, very warm. The circle of gold it throws across the wood. Still there. The candle burns. It has been burning a long time. It will burn a little longer. The room around it. Quiet. Still. The rose water. Faint. The flame. You're here. The room is warm. The dark is soft. Let it hold you. The candle burns. Still. Rest now.